I know the first time that I ever took a look at a draft, it was something from 1898. In fact, let me bring it up here. Okay, here it is. This is the actual first document that I ever looked at, and it wasn't even in PDF format for me, okay? I got this from costumes.org a long time ago. It was a bunch of scanned in JPEGs, and when I started looking at these, I was following certain Google keywords, and I ran across, if I can get to the fashion plates here, these. I ran into these pictures of what looks like a part of a coat with no real explanation about what was going on, and it looked like, okay, it's half a coat. And that's how I started learning how to tailor, was what am I looking at here? How does this make a coat? So that's the first thing I'm going to teach you. I'm going to show you how to read one of these patterns. I'm going to look at the anatomy of all of these individual pieces that you see on all of these different types of pages. And regardless of how old the pattern is, how old the draft is, the same components are still there. So the book that I studied the most, it's the Modern Tailor, Outfitter, and Clothier. I'm going to bring up my website here. If you go to the library, there are several different documents that I have already finished, and these are what I'm going to use for a lot of the reference, simply because they're already finished, they're completely digitized, and you can do keyword searches if you ever need to find anything very quick. I'm mainly going to be referring to 1949, the Modern Tailor, Outfitter, and Clothier. I have to fix that up. I don't even have the name of the book correctly on my website. That's great. Okay, well, I'm going to fix that up real quick. There, it's fixed. By the time you get to this, it's going to have the right name. That was rather embarrassing. I highly advise everyone to read every single word that's in this book. It's going to take a long time. It reads like a textbook. Slightly boring unless you are very analytical and critically minded. You might read over some of these chapters and it's just going to gloss over you, but that's okay. It glossed over me too. It took several readings. It took months of experience of actually getting into it and actually sewing things before I realized how what these concepts were, how they pieced together. I'm going to try to help you with that. I'm going to try to give you a bit of a compass. And that's part of what I'm going to do today, is essentially teach you how to read a draft in the first place. This third chapter here, the principles of cutting, I'm going to bring this open here. It's mainly text. I'm not going to read this verbatim to you, but I highly recommend for you to read this chapter simply because it gives a very verbose explanation and teaches you how to understand why cutting is done the way it is, and it gives you a general synopsis. But for now, I'm just going to go over some basic anatomy. This is the full draft that I made of a three-piece suit that I describe in one of my other videos, and I'm looking at this for the first time in about 3 years. It's interesting for me to look at this, actually, because I'm seeing some of the mistakes that I made and how I corrected them. I'm seeing a lot of my own history here, and it's really interesting. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to prepare this a little bit more than it is and get the. There's a lot to explain, and it's very difficult to break it down and say we should talk about this first, and then this second, and then this third. First of all, this section here, we have a coat. There's no arm on the coat. Those are over here. Okay. The middle section is the person's waistcoat or vest. And this section here is the customer's trousers. These three items make up the three-piece suit. After the pattern's made, the thread marks are put onto the cloth. The cloth is also cut at the same time, and it's handed off to the tailor, to the actual coat maker, or the person who's actually going to be making the garments. I'll go over the specifics of these in just a moment, but for now I'm going to slide on over to here, which shows the layout of all of the pieces. I put this together in a layout to make the most of the fabric that I had. I had some navy pinstripe fabric that I had used, and I put it into a 28-inch wide layout according to the lengths that I had available to me. I had 2 lengths of it. So by doing this, I was able to figure out. Now you're going to see some parts on here that are not over here. How did I do that, and why did I do it that way? Because you use these patterns to make linings, facings. All of these extra pieces are made either from extra fabric that you have on the side, or you just you make it up on the fly when you're making the coat. It's a lot different than going to simplicity and having every single little piece already laid out for you. And it's a lot easier than you think it is. You just have to know what to do and when to do it. Okay, so let's take a look at the components of what makes up a draft. There's going to be a few things in here that you don't have to pay attention to as much as other things, but it's all right here in front of us, so let's start taking a look at it. First of all, this section is the back piece. This is the back of the neck. This is the center back. Goes all the way down. You can see now the blue lines. The blue lines are the construction guides that you start mapping out first before you make the black lines. Okay, so the blue lines are showing. I'm going to make this a little bit simpler to look at here. Okay. All right, so these blue lines here are what ended up getting drawn before or during, in the middle of the process of making the coat. I'm going to superimpose the coat lines on top of it to give you an idea about what these things are. There are 3 important widths or girths that you have to be familiar with. The first one is this line right there. This line is the chest width. It goes from the center of the back around the side of the body to the middle of the front of the chest, which is from here to here, okay? So try to picture that. In the middle right here, this is where the chest would start to overlap. So in other words, everything past this section, the 2 fronts of the jacket are going to be overlapping. Now, there might be a little bit less overlap by the time that the jacket is done being made, but this is the general guide of the amount of overlap that you want to have. So that's what you draw out. Underneath that, the next major girth line is the waist. This is the natural waist. There are 2 different types of waists that are used commonly in making garments. There's a natural waist, and then there's a fashion waist, which we'll get into a little bit later. A fashion waist is the imaginary waistline that a particular coat or trousers might use to make it, to draw the eye away from the natural waist, to change or manipulate the person's appearance. So in other words, this blue line here is where the human waist would be measured at, but the fashion waist might be a little bit lower. It might be down here. We don't know. Okay, so this particular garment doesn't have a fashion waist. It could. If you're the cutter and you say, okay, well, I want to make the person's waist a little bit lower, you can do that. there are so many things that you have the capability of doing. It's like woodworking. There are so many, there's rules that people and standards that people go by, but you are the creator. You are the person, you're the artist who's creating this coat. It might not come out as good, but it would come out the way that you told it to, okay? The next one down is the hips. This is the widest area of the hips that goes around the seat, okay? In other words, by this point down here, the most girth going around the front of the crotch, around the width of the hips, and toward the prominence of the seat. That's what this hip line is. So that's why these three measurements, when you take the tape measure around and you take the chest, the waist, and the hips, those three are laid out onto this pattern when you draw it. When you take the measurements, which we'll get into in another video, it'll be connected to this one. When you take those measurements, it's not tight. The extra amount is to make room for any undergarments and for any breathing room that person might want. Usually it's about 1.5 inches to 2 inches more. It's advisable to add more room than it is to have to add it later. In other words, draw it with more room involved so that way you can take a little bit away here, take a little bit away there, because once you start cutting the fabric, that's it. You can't add onto the fabric, you can only subtract from it. So make sure that you give the customer plenty of room to be able to breathe and to have room for the undergarments. So when you take your measurements, keep that in mind. Let's look at some of the lengths. There are multiple lengths on this pattern that you might not even see yet. Lengths are, in other words, vertical measurements. Girths are horizontal measurements. So the vertical measurements that we're seeing here are the depth of the shoulder slope, the depth of the prominence of the shoulder blade that goes halfway down the upper back, the depth of the side of the armhole, the side, okay, the armscye. An armscye is an armhole. In other words, the arm's eye. That's where that word came from. It's the same line as the chest. In other words, the depth at which you take the chest measurement, it may or may not coincide, especially if you are a woman. If you're a woman, you have your bust size, and then there's still a different one, which would be the depth of the bust and the depth of the armhole could be different. It could also be different on a man as well, depending on the cut of the coat that's being made. Okay, they can be independent of each other. In this particular coat, they're one and the same. The depth of the waist, or the length, okay? The length of the natural waist is this one right here, which that's why the waist was put at that measure. The depth of the hips, this may or may not be a measurement that you take on the customer. Sometimes the drafts have a relative measurement that they use when you draft the coat, and you'll see that. It'll say it's a certain amount of inches away from the waist, or they could say it's a set amount. It's up to you. You can either go by with what they're saying, or you can take the measurement yourself and put it there. Once again, it's up to you. And then there's the length or the depth, whatever you want to call it, of the actual coat. In other words, all the way from the very beginning point to the very bottom of the garment. That's also a length as well, the length of the coat, of the full coat. Let's take a look at this measurement right here. This is an important measurement because the back of the coat needs enough room for the person to be able to move the arms up in front of them. Otherwise, it'll be too tight. The customer will feel it. They won't be able to move their arms around. They'll feel it in the back. If you ever put on a coat or a jacket and you're just like, no, this is way too small, and they say, oh, well, it must be your chest size. Not necessarily. It could be the amount taken from the middle of the back to the back of the armhole. It may not have enough room in there. This is called the across back measurement. There's two ways that you can take this measurement. You can go all the way across the back, or you can go halfway across the back. When you're making the draft, it's halfway, because right here's the middle of the spine over to the armhole. So sometimes when you take the measurement, you can take the measurement all the way from armhole to armhole across the back, and then divide that by 2. In other words, divide it in half, and that's where you get this right here. I want to go into direct measures for shoulders and for fronts, but I don't know if I should do that yet. Even though they come out a little bit more accurate and I personally prefer them, there are ways to get these measurements just from relative scales. So I'm not going to cover these diagonal ones in this video. I'm going to link to another video to talk specifically about those measurements. Here you can see just some guides that I put together to figure out where I'm going to put the chest welt pocket. The same thing, here's some guides that I put together to figure out where I might put the hip pocket. The pocket mouth would be right here, and then the actual pocket would be hidden inside the coat. You wouldn't see that unless, of course, the person had something in their pockets making it bulge out. This line right here, from here to here, that line shows where the lapel flaps back at. In other words, that's like the pivot line, the axle, if you will. If you can picture this, let me see if I can grab it and make it look something. If you could picture this flapping backward, okay, this is where the lapel would roll back at. It's called the roll line, in fact. That's what this is called. It's called a roll line. Not only do you need to mark that down simply to know how big your lapel is, but when you're making the coat, there's a piece of tape that you put down to urge it to move in that direction. It gives the coat a general idea about where the fabric should stop flapping back. Okay. I'm going to take away the coat lines for a moment here because I want to show you this line. This line here was the guideline that shows the middle of the dart for what would be a side seam. Okay. In this particular coat, this is a very simple coat. The side seam stopped right here at the hip pocket, and so did this seam right here. Both of these are considered darts. In fact, let me take them away just for a moment to show you what it looks like underneath. If there were no darts there, this would be one single piece of material without any seams at all. It wouldn't fit as well because there wouldn't be enough waist suppression. They can vary depending on the person's physique and depending on how much the tailor or the cutter wants to take away from the waist. All of these lines are here, this one, and then this area right here. If you notice, this is where the least amount of fabric going across the body is going to cover because that's where the cuts are biggest. See right here, the waist seam is biggest right here. It gently slopes down from the back of the armhole down to the mid back of the waist. This entire area, imagine this is where the arm is going to be. So that's why they put the seam there, so that way the arm is hiding that seam so it's not as obvious. You don't want to have a lot of seams when you're cutting a coat. The less seams you have, the better. That was the whole idea. They wanted everything to look graceful. They wanted it to look like it was one piece of material all the way down, because you're covering the body. Why have a bunch of seams? This seam, sometimes you don't even see it. Depends on the person. Sometimes the person is a little bit chubbier. Okay? I don't need to have that seam, because that might even be not enough to cover my corpulence. Okay? This, on a bigger person might end up being a little bit more down there, so that way they can cover the front. There's so many things that the cutter will do. And over the years, they started making guides for people to use to make cuts for corpulent people. In this particular garment here, you're also going to see a cut or a seam. It's going to give you, say, cut out a piece of fabric, just make a cut right here, and you're like, why? Why do you want that cut here? Well, if you noticed something, and this took a while for me to figure out on my own, but it made very natural sense once I understood it. The chest area is one of the areas that has the most fabric. You want it because you want that masculine look. You want what's called the fullness or the prominence of the chest to be located primarily here. If you notice, it's about midway between the front of the armscye. It's midway between where the lapel rolls back, and it's halfway between the waist and the neck point. The neck point is right here. This line right here is called the neck point. Let me bring this over here. I found this. This was part of Stone's advanced superlative coat and vest system. It was from a book that was from 1910. And this made it click for me. Why the armhole or the armscye is shaped the way it is. Note the coat, first of all, is facing from right to left, and this coat is facing from left to right. That's simply just the way that they decided to draw the coat. Apparently Americans, or apparently Mr. Stone, wanted to do it from right to left. This is also the way that the Germans like to do it as well. They like to do it from right to left. Anyway, so disregard the meaning of all of these different letters just for a moment. Look at the cut of the shoulder. The shoulder seam. This is the front of the shoulder seam, and this is the back of the shoulder seam. Okay? Imagine both of these seams being folded around to fit on top of a person's shoulder. This is the person's arm coming through the armhole, and imagine between, let's say, K through 1. This is where that seam is going to end up showing up, and this is going to be the person's face right here where it says plate. Okay, so just picture that in your mind. See how this comes down here and this comes down here and it meets up? See, I couldn't figure it out. Why do you want it to go upward when the person's shoulder is round? It's because when you move this piece of fabric in front of the person's body, it's automatically going to wrap around the arm. So this makes sense in two-dimensional, but not in three-dimensional. When you change it to a three-dimensional figure, the fabric is going to wrap around the person's body, and it's suddenly going to turn into a curve. Got me the first time. So if you think about it this way, this solid piece of fabric here, in fact, let me take away the coat guides for a moment just to make it easier to look at. This entire piece of fabric is going to be the most prominent area where there's not going to be any cuts. So up here, this cutaway right here, it's a small one, and it's also optional. Sometimes you don't need to put it on, but in this case, this particular draft, they advise you to put it in there. It's going to be hidden from the lapel. When the lapel ends up getting flapped over, it's going to be in the back of the lapel. You're not going to see it. This is the front gorge of the neck, and this helps take away some of the fullness around the neck to add it to the prominence of the chest, to make it stand out a little bit more. This is the original page of the draft. If it's from 1937, it's giving a step-by-step instruction from 1 to 0, from 0 to all these. You have to follow these instructions precisely and then using this pictorial version of the draft as a guide, and then also looking at the way this person looks in the sketch to know what you're making. This was a style called the Knightsbridge. They gave it that name in 1937. Let's take a look at this guy here a little bit, okay? Look how prominent his chest is. That's a big shoulder look right there. Imagine if this person isn't as slim as this person. You're going to need to make the chest even bigger to kind of give that person the look. And you notice from the chest down here, it's very straight. This entire cut is very straight. But look at the draft. It's curved. What do you do for that? That was part of the what's called a crooked cut. We're going to have to get into that in a whole different section. But a crooked cut, simply put, is a way of manipulating a solid piece of cloth to get it to fit around the chest when you want it so big. There was various ways that they made crooked cuts, that's why I'm going to have to make another video to try to get into it and explain it. But crooked cuts, that's what the purpose was for. So the neck, this wasn't that large, okay? Some cuts, they come here, but the ending look is huge. How did they do that? Well, it's from this crooked cut. The same thing about the waist suppression. The waist suppression also helps with getting that chest prominence out there. And then it just, from here, very gradually slides down the person's body, and by the time it's done, it should cut straight around the back, around the seat, to the other side. If this person's hand weren't in their pocket, the coat would be a little bit open there, unless he had decided to have the button closed. But it would fit, the bottom of the coat would be flat around the bottom of the seat. If you notice down here, though, the bottom of this coat is not going a 90-degree angle with the back. Why not? Well, imagine, okay, I'm going to try to rotate this. This is why I love Illustrator. You can take things and you can manipulate them and move them around. Remember how I was talking about that crooked cut? Okay, the prominence of the chest, we want that big chest coming up. We want the front of this coat coming straight down. What if we were to rotate it like this? Look what happens. When you get this seam meeting this seam here, right around that point, look what suddenly happens. Now, why didn't they draw it that way? Because it wouldn't match up with the person's natural body areas. In other words, suddenly the neck point is up here. That's too far up. Suddenly the armhole isn't low enough right here. So that's why they made it at the angle that it was, because it has to be to match the person's body. But at the same time, they have to manipulate the fabric to be able to get in the right shape that they wanted to fool the eye into thinking that, hey, this guy's more buff than he actually is, right? It's a subliminal thing. Brilliance, isn't it? Let's take a look at this back shoulder seam here. Now, what's this squiggly line for? Well, this just is another type of manipulation that they would use. They still use it today. The back shoulder seam is longer than the front shoulder seam. I can take this. I can actually take this line right here, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to bring it over here for a second, okay? And I'm going to get this line here. Do the same thing. Copy, paste, and I'm going to bring it in over here. And I'm going to go to, and don't worry about doing this unless you happen to have Illustrator. I'm just showing you to be really OCD to show you, hey, this thing's longer. I'm going to look at this object, and I'm going to look at the length right here. The length of the front shoulder seam is 5.5985. The back one is about half an inch longer. This one is 594. This one's 559. So it's about just a little bit less than half of an inch longer. Why? Very simple reason. In order for there to be and we're going to go back to the back piece here for a moment. In order for there to be enough back piece material to get around the prominence of the shoulder blade. Remember, this is going to be like a little hill because it's right here down the middle of the spine is not going to be as wide as the shoulder blade is over here. Imagine if we didn't have enough fabric where this entire piece was... Let me see if I can get all the points and bring them in, because I want to make sure that you understand this. All of these pieces, imagine if it was half an inch shorter. Okay, that's about half an inch, maybe a little bit less, or just probably around the point where it's at. Suddenly, we're not able to get around the waist, the bottom. This part down here is not as important, but this upper part here is. The armhole's not in the right position. So this section up here wouldn't be long enough to provide the amount of material for that for the shoulder blades. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and yeah, I'm going to type it in right there. I should have been doing this the entire time. See? See, people? We should have been putting research money into this. Okay. Right here, this is where the shoulder blades are. In this, I'm going to make a circle. I'm going to make a circle. Right there. This is where the shoulder... Whoa. Okay, hold on. I'm going to make it green. Okay. Where is... Okay, I'm going to make it thicker so you can see the lines. Okay. This green area there, that's where the prominence of the shoulder blades is, because you got to get over that little bump. Down here, this is the prominence of the chest. Okay, in this area here, remember, we're not going on a flat body. We're going to be going around a human being. Okay. Let's see, what other... Oh yeah, well, technically the seat also has prominence, but that's being handled by this round line here, these set of round lines. When you remember how I rotated these pieces out? Using that, the back of the armhole as a pivot. Right here, suddenly, look how big the waist suppression is being cut away. There's a big gap in there. And it all ends up meeting up together again down here, where this is where the seat is. And it just kind of flows over the seat. And flows over the sides of the hips as well, because you got hip bones, okay? So it's got to get over that, so that's why this is curved. Makes sense, doesn't it? And then, I'm going to put that back here. Crooked cut. Just, I'm going to see if I can label this so I can make it make somewhat sense. Just to have it kind of like a map so you can see it. Okay, I'm going to get a green line. I'm going to go from here to here. And I'm just going to say this area here, this shoulder thing, it can be moved forward. It can be moved back. The further back you move it, the more fabric you're going to end up having over here. But the further back the neck point is, the more you're going to have to straighten it using your iron with steam. I can get some really weird looking... I'm not even going to get into it right now, okay? But just trust me, it can get really weird, really funky. Back in the 19th century, they were kind of crazy on this, okay? They used to manipulate that fabric with iron and steam a lot more than they do now. But this entire area here, I'm going to mark it down as your shoulder seam, but I'm going to label it as the amount for your crooked cut. Let's put it this way. If this entire seam here were brought over this way, suddenly it's a lot more straight than it is if it's over here. You don't have as much room to get around that armhole. Technically, just imagine what it would look like. It wouldn't even fit around the body properly. Well, like I said, we'll get into all of that later on. That's going to be a big thing about crooked cuts I'm going to talk about. The side panel, this would be about right where it would be. Some jackets, this is made of an entirely separate panel that's cut all the way down to the bottom. A separate piece of fabric altogether. Sometimes they call it the side body. Especially when you're dealing with an older type of coat that has a waist seam. This area in the front here is called your front body. This entire thing from here to here is going to be it's your front body piece. Over here, armscye. In other words, armscye. That's where that word came from. Armscye. They decided to put it into its own word. I don't know. Tailor said their own thing going, I guess. Gonna copy this over. This black line, that's your front dart. Over here's your side dart. And both of these darts are put in there to be able to take away waist suppression to make it nice and shapely. This is your lapel. Right here. Up here. Okay, I'm going to see. Your gorge. Hey, gorge. It's the part that goes from the neck. The neck point. It's the part that goes from the neck point, which I'm going to make a little green area pointing to this right here. That's the gorge of the neck. So you can call it that. You can actually call it a neck gorge. Right there. Your width of your lapel can change. This blue line right here. This is the front center line. And I'm going to turn that on its side. Okay. That's where the front of the chest is going to be. The front of the body, the physical body, should be right there. Question that people might have. Why is there this flat little area here? Good question. I'm glad you asked it. Well, remember, we have seams. We have pieces of fabric that we're seaming together. This coat is giving us the seam allowance. In other words, there's an extra 1/4 of an inch in the back seam. There's an extra 1/4 of an inch on each one of these seams. Same thing for these ones. So here's a good way of doing it. This is another reason why I love Illustrator. Just bear with me here. Check this out. I'm going to offset each one of these. I'm going to offset the path by negative 0.25 inches. And suddenly, we have these double lines here. If you look at it, suddenly, the seam allowance is gone. That little bump area there is gone. This part here matches with this part right here. At least it should. It's a little bit off. So I'm going to take these pieces over. I'm going to bring them over here just to play with them for a second. Okay. I'm going to bring this over here and see suddenly this armhole area, it looks a little bit more flowing, round. I made an article on my website talking about the anatomy or the geology of a coat. It kind of explains it in further detail what I'm talking about here, about these circles being there. When you look at the pieces put together, it doesn't lay down flat on your table. It does not lay down flat on the table. When it lays down flat on the table, that means it's not going to lay down flat on a circle, a cylinder, a human being, an hourglass, if you will. Okay? All right. If everything that I've talked about, chest prominence and waist suppression and everything, don't make any sense yet, think of it this way. When you have a map, a two-dimensional map of, let's see, map of the world. And Russia is so huge, and Greenland is massive and everything. This is distorted. Imagine trying to put this on a globe, on an actual sphere. It wouldn't work. When they make globes, they take the pieces of paper and they split them up into sections like this. This is what we're looking at when we look at this. It's the equivalent of the same thing. All of these cuts are so that way the seams will fit together when you fit it on something that's not flat. That's exactly what's going on here. All of these seams to make up this world globe are put together and they meet up at the top. This is how you make a globe. You know, next time you go to the secondhand store or something, or you go to your, oh God, don't you miss the KCET stores? I used to love that thing, Natural Wonders. All of the sections of the coordinates of longitude and latitude is usually where they put them, where the seams meet up. Take a look at your globe. That's exactly what these are. So just imagine that. When you're cutting, imagine you're putting together flat pieces of cloth and canvas and linings and putting them together to fit onto the shape of a human being. That's what this entire third chapter of the modern tailor, outfitter, and clothier is essentially talking about. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about balance, waist suppression, straightness and crookedness, or the location of the neck point, the governing factors. They're talking about it in written words, with not that many pictures except for this. We're going to get into the specifics about how to make an actual garment draft next. So keep all of these things in mind and definitely read Chapter 3 of this. And if you want to, actually read Chapter 4 as well. You can look at it if you want. If you enjoyed so far what you're looking at, go ahead and look at it. But this gets into the whole, it looks like Da Vinci's sketch of a human, doesn't it? They talk about proportions, human proportions, and what is generally ideal human proportions. I also have an article on my website where I discussed that. The 8-head proportion was ideally what was considered, since Greek times, it was considered the superhuman. This gets into anatomy in general. You can get so deep into this subject, the proportions and how they change during the development of a human being. The superhuman, the uberhuman proportions for art, This is still the same human being. Look at this person. He's 9 heads tall, where the average real person for academics is 7.5. So this is another section of something that you can look at and study. So remember, it's not simply just about following the instructions. The instructions are very precise, and it will come out with something that I would say is 80 to 90% accurate for that person's body. But there's more to think about on top of that. And an experienced cutter will already have these things floating around in their mind as they eyeball the customer. I once walked into a tailor's shop, and without the person even taking my measurements, he eyed me up, took a suit off the rack. It was a well-tailored suit, as that. It was a off-the-rack, off-the-peg suit. It was not even custom made for me. And it fit. That's how good this guy... He had on the wall, he had his certificate from Chicago, from his tailoring academy class from the 1960s, hanging on his wall. That's how long this person had been doing this. But those are the basics of how to even understand what you're looking at here in a draft. I haven't even gotten to the sleeves yet, have I? I haven't even started talking about the waistcoats. This is just for the coat that I was going over. We still have so much to go over, just dealing with the basics. Now, waistcoats and... Okay, waistcoats, just real quick. Waistcoats, they use the same principles. Look at this. You have the chest. You have the natural waist. You don't have the hips because the waistcoat doesn't come down that far. You have the front center line. There's not as much overlap, as you can see here. There's more overlap on the part where the buttons go, but there's not as much on the part where the buttonholes go. These little markings right here, these are balance markings. We'll get into those. This little dotted line that I made for myself, this was just like a little eyeball guide to say, okay, this is where the back strap is going to go. This dotted line here showed me this is how far up the neck, the part of the neck that actually goes on top of this area here. Yes, this part right here ends up going around the back of the neck. And why? Well, we'll get into that later on. Here's the armhole, same deal. Notice the armhole meets up right at the bottom, so you don't need to have that step like we did on the coat. It's right there at the bottom where the seam is, okay? That's the basics of a waistcoat. And over here, we got the trousers. This is a whole different thing altogether. We're going to have to go over that. It's going to be a separate video or a series of videos looking at cuts of trousers, looking at this and trying to wrap your brain about how these pieces of fabric meet together is something else altogether. For me, it was actually harder to figure out than it was the coat. Partially because there's not that much instruction. All of these books that I've been reading and where I started learning, they go over about the coat. They go into so much more detail about the coat than they do about the trousers. And then we have the sleeves. We're going to have to get into that later on. I'll just tell you, why is this sleeve longer than this one? Because I messed up. When I was making the coat, I made the sleeve too long. And I'll go over why that happened, but that'll be for another video. And then we'll get into the secondary pieces. How to make a collar. If you notice, this collar here is a separate piece altogether that you make later on. You don't make it up front. You make it in the middle of the coat. You derive the measurements for your collar after you have started making up your coat. Otherwise, you don't know how big to make it. Unless you're really good. Which, even today, I go to YouTube, look up videos on bespoke tailoring, and you'll see the coat partially made, and the collar looks like this big flappy thing that's hanging off the sides of their arms because they don't know how big to make it yet. It's because they got a false piece of fabric that they haven't actually cut down to size yet. They just have like a generally cut collar. Okay, so that's a partially made collar that they'll use for fittings. But that's about it. Before we even get into facings, coat facings, before we even get into inlays, which are all of these extra pieces of fabric here, that's going to be a different thing. Flies, pocket welts, hip flaps, all of these extra secondary things that you have to learn to cut, those are all figured out after you've started making the coat. Don't even worry about it yet. Just worry about, well, don't worry, just concentrate on these three basic ones for now, which I'll have videos for each and every single one of these things. Man, we got a lot to cover, but there you go. That's my first video. I hope you guys sat through the entire thing. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. If anything that I have discussed flew over your head, please let me know. I don't mind remaking this video again and again and again, making it shorter, simpler to understand, more comprehensive. I consider this to be the rough draft, okay? It might change, it might go viral, who knows, whatever. But that's the basics of how to read a draft, how the anatomy of a draft. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos. See you soon.